and welcome to another edition of DDHQ election night. Tonight we are monitoring and analyzing the South Carolina Democratic primary. My name is Drew McCoy. I'm joined by most of the usual gang, Scott Tranter, Dr. Alexander Podcool, and also we have Daniel Short joining us tonight. So pretty full cast for a big night. This is a different state than we've had before. It's a larger state, more diverse, heavily African American, and it's a state that's being watched because it's a really good chance for Joe Biden and maybe some other candidates to either blunt Bernie Sanders' momentum or launch their own campaign. Okay, why don't we just giving everybody's thoughts on this? Why don't we start with Dr. Alexander Podcool? What are you looking for tonight?
Hey, I'm looking to see whether or not there's going to be a Biden, just a huge victory for Biden to the point where he could come out of today with all of the delegates out of South Carolina if some of those thresholds aren't met by some of the other candidates. And we could be waking up tomorrow where Biden's the delegate leader. I understand that may not happen, but that's something that we could be paying attention to. And alternatively, we're looking at a big state. We're looking at hundreds of thousands of votes here. And so we're looking at hundreds of thousands of votes. And so we could even have a different popular vote leader by the end of the night, too. And so I think just setting the table as we go into Super Tuesday is really what everybody is mostly going to be watching for. That's just, I guess, sort of the big takeaway. We have on the line minor correction to Drew. We have Matt Shore on the line, and so to Matt, what are you kind of paying attention to this evening?
Thanks, Podcool. I would say that I'm interested in seeing how Biden's margins hold up in some of the majority or at least plurality black counties in South Carolina, and not only seeing, obviously I think we expect he will win those pretty handily, but seeing how he does compared to Sanders, of course, but even compared to Steyer and some of the other candidates who have been trying to make inroads in that community, seeing if he's able to beat back the challenge in those counties, and seeing how Sanders is able to perform in some of the counties with younger populations, the counties that have a college campus in them, counties that are whiter. He performed noticeably better in whiter counties in 2016. So seeing how some of those battle lines get drawn as we look forward to Super Tuesday, you don't want to read too much into one state, but some of those trends might be something we can find some patterns in tonight. And I think that'll be an interesting thing to follow as we get some results.
Yeah, I think you sort of bring up a good point there, Short, where yes, we're sort of paying attention to what the top line is and who the winner is, and I mean, it's Joe Biden is going to be the winner, but I think really what we're paying attention to are the margins here. It's I think the difference between, say, Biden and Sanders in second place, that margin is going to be big. Another point is going to be just paying attention to those thresholds to see where the delegates go. Again, there's sort of a long road ahead if it turns out that we're paying attention to the likelihood of a contested convention in Milwaukee, and so it could be a long road ahead. But I don't know if you heard that in the background, but as I said before, it's very likely Joe Biden wins. It looks like Decision Desk HQ is in fact calling it for Joe Biden. Drew, what's your hot take here? This looks like the night is a lot maybe younger. I mean, Shore, what's your hot take, Shore?
Well, I mean, I guess we probably steer away from the rank punditry that you might get on a cable network. But I mean, obviously, right, coming into this, we expected that Biden would win. In public polling, he's been leading by a wide margin in South Carolina. Things got a little bit hairy after Iowa and New Hampshire, but he was able to steady the ship, have a couple of strong debate performances, get that Jim Clyburn endorsement, which, certainly seems to have helped him in South Carolina. So I think that in that sense, obviously it was expected. And, we'll continue to watch here tonight when we actually get some tangible results. is, like you were saying, those margins and looking at who can maybe consolidate support in certain counties. You know, how does Joe Biden perform? Obviously, the winner in we would expect that he would win pretty handily in majority black counties, but is he vanquishing the field? You know, is Steyer underperforming where he was polling, which was raising some eyebrows? Can Buttigieg make any inroads in those kinds of counties? Can Klobuchar, or is Biden kind of able to close that window?
Hey, sure. I
Yeah,
have here's a quick question. I think
sure.
related to sort of what you're talking about. I mean, those who are following maybe the prediction markets or even the polling for that matter, it seemed to be that it looked like Bernie was tightening against Joe Biden. I mean, do we think that was even real? It could have just been sort of speculation. I mean, on the poll side, I am convinced to say, well, maybe he did get a boost, but it could have been one of these effects where maybe just Biden people weren't answering the phone, not unlike we see after some of the general election debates in the past. Sort of, I guess the overall question is, I mean, was this Bernie bump even real?
Well, I mean, I think that that's a fair question. You know, what I find even more interesting, perhaps, is were the Buttigieg or Klobuchar bumps real at all? You know, Sanders, at least you could see it in some polling. Obviously, fundraising has not been a problem for him from small donations, but thinking about the way we tend to think about this process of, well, you perform better than expected in the first few states, you roll that into momentum and you kind of ride that wave through the process. And it seems like for Sanders, he's been pretty, steady Eddie at around the top. He's got a pretty high floor of support. And then the folks who have kind of surprised and beaten expectations in those early states, folks like Buttigieg in Iowa and Klobuchar in New Hampshire, they haven't really taken the reins of this race, like you may have expected based on previous cycles, or at least on the wisdom of the crowd. Um, and I also think that it's interesting that Biden, who underperformed, performed quote unquote worse than expected in those first handful of states, seems to have found new life in South Carolina. And that's not something that, typically by the time you get a couple states in, that supposed momentum is supposed to have kind of baked in. So I think it's an interesting cycle already in that it seems to be maybe bucking some of the conventional wisdom about how momentum works in this process, or as George H.W. Bush called it, the big mo.
That's true. I mean, speaking of conventional wisdom, what do we think about the convention coming up? Do we think it's going to be a divided convention or not?
Well, I think that that's something that we've kicked around a little bit, is the idea that, well, if Sanders is the plurality winner and he comes to the debate with, over 40% of pledged delegates and a clear plurality in primary votes, would the party elites want to take the political risk of snatching that nomination away from that plurality leader and handing it to someone else? Maybe somebody who finished behind him, or maybe to someone who didn't even run actively. Um, whether or not they want to hit that Hubert Humphrey panic button remains to be seen. I think I'm probably more skeptical that that would be the best strategy if you're a partisan and your main concern is just to win. Um, but I guess I could be convinced otherwise if if you wanted to play devil's advocate.
Yeah, I mean, the Aussie Optimist and Decision Desk HQ forecast right now has a probability that the 39% chance that there's no majority. So that is that no single candidate will walk into the convention on the first ballot with a majority of the votes. And I think a lot of people going into this race, that is going into Iowa, were thinking that that was a real possibility. But when we just look at the delegate math, the proportional allocation of delegates, in addition to the still large number of candidates, it could be a pretty high likelihood. And then we still have the sleeping giant of Michael Bloomberg sitting and waiting in the wings on Super Tuesday, which really could just throw a whole wrench in anybody's plans to amass a large number of delegates on Super Tuesday.
Yeah, and I think that you bring up a useful distinction, which is the difference between will somebody walk into the convention with a majority of pledged delegates, or will nobody hit that threshold? And I think that that's a different scenario than the party will broker their nomination and give it to somebody who isn't that plurality leader. So I think that really the question is, what do you think happens in the scenarios that fall in the range of nobody has a majority of delegates outright, but there's a clear plurality winner?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, this was one of the questions that candidates were fielding on the debate stage. Sort of, if this scenario had come up, what exactly will they do? And who really knows? There's speculation, as you had mentioned earlier. There's speculation. There was that article in the New York Times where they had interviewed a number of superdelegates who essentially said they have no problem trying to deny the nomination of Bernie if it were to get that to that point in Milwaukee. But at the same point, that would be pretty difficult for the party, for their overall nomination strategy, and just really thinking about how these rules are played. And so I think a lot of rank and file Democrats and even delegates would be pretty disappointed if they were to walk away from Milwaukee and it wasn't the plurality leader. At the same time, however, that's the rules of the game, is you need the majority. And so if you are the plurality leader, it just becomes sort of a game as to what's going to happen here. I don't think that the party leaders who had changed the rules on superdelegate voting had really anticipated something like this. Where they may actually have the power on the second ballot to actually say something meaningful in deciding who the party's nominee will be. But you never know. All of these rules have serious consequences, and it's pretty. We don't exactly know yet. It looks like there may be some unintended consequences that Bernie folks may have made in their attempts to try and change the rules.
Well, and at the very least, it gives us some fun hypothetical scenarios to run through in our heads. Of, my my God, is that Al Gore's music or something like that?
Oh yeah. So we'll see. Now, on the screen right now, we still have 0 votes in from South Carolina. However, Decision Desk HQ has called the race for Joe Biden. But what we're paying attention to really for the rest of the evening is we're going to be looking at some of those vote margins, what the overall tallies are, and what the delegate allocation is going to look like at the end of the evening. So we have called the race for Vice President Joe Biden. This is pretty much exactly, I think, what he needed. He definitely needed a win, although I think in some of the Decision Desk HQ earlier episodes of Around the Desk, we had discussed what different thresholds he needed to meet. I think on the last edition of Around the Desk that we had yesterday, I think when we went around, there were a few of us who said he needs to definitely break a double-digit lead over Bernie Sanders. But if the trend in polling is any indication, it could be a much wider lead than that. And so we'll kind of see as the rest of the night goes on.
That's Alexander Podcool. I'm Matt Shore. We're Decision Desk HQ live stream results of the South Carolina Democratic presidential primary. There is a Republican primary, or no, did they cancel their primary this year?
That's a good question. I'm not sure.
I think they canceled it on second thought. But at the very least, Joe Biden is the projected winner in South Carolina for the Democrats. A much needed win after disappointing showings in Iowa and New Hampshire and a loss to Bernie Sanders in Nevada. And what we'll be watching the rest of the night is how Biden's margins hold up in the state. How big of a lead does he take statewide? How does he perform in certain key counties? And what might we be able to deduce from that about the candidate's abilities to get certain coalitions behind them to coalesce and maybe leave some other candidates out in the lurch?
Yeah, speaking of some of those key counties, Shore, what are your thoughts? What are some of the big places that you're going to be paying attention to this evening?
Yeah, so obviously, the biggest county, making up about 14% of the vote in the 2016 Democratic primary, is Richland County. It's the largest county by expected votes. It's plurality Black, and it's also the youngest county by median age, and that's because it is home to the University of South Carolina. And so that's obviously in terms of the county that we think would be doing the most in terms of driving the overall result. You look for the largest county, and that's where it is in terms of expected votes here. There's also Charleston, second most expected votes. It's the highest education by county, on the higher end of income, somewhat younger, home of the College of Charleston. And so that's a place where Sanders would hope that his margin would be better. Um, and we'll see if that comes to fruition. We also want to see, because it's a higher education and higher income city, or county rather, if Buttigieg, Klobuchar, Warren, how they perform in that kind of environment. Um, and then looking at a handful of counties where Sanders performed better in 2016. Pickens County, again, a younger county, home of Clemson University. It's also over 90% white. And it was Sanders' best county in 2016. He won about 44%, despite only winning about he won about 26% statewide. So that's one county to watch. And then for Biden, looking at the handful of majority Black counties, Fairfield, Marion, Orangeburg, can he really run up the score in those kind of counties? Can he vanquish the Tom Steyers of the field? If he's able to do that, then he's on his way to a very, very strong night. And again, if he's able to maybe perform well in places like Charleston, places like Pickens, places like Lexington, where they're younger, they're whiter, if Biden can have better margins in those places, it's going to help him overall.
Yeah, that's good analysis. Thanks, Shore. I think also, actually, if we look at our screens, we have some votes coming in. Looks like we have 50 total votes coming out of Fairfield County. And as you were talking about some of these places, you had pointed out, highlighting some of the demographic trends of what the counties look like, and maybe what they could tell us about the electorate. This is a majority African American county in Fairfield, and so it's a way too early to over extrapolate anything from this whatsoever, because again, we have 50 votes out of the county, and yet we're sort of expecting about 4,000 to 5,000 to come out of the county. So I don't know if we'll write that home quite yet, but we are starting to finally see some votes come in. We're about 15 minutes after 7, as we're sort of seeing some of this vote come in. One of the, I mean, well, let's look at it right now. In second place is billionaire Tom Steyer. What's his kind of play? What's his play for the rest of the race? I mean, he doesn't. Does he have a ticket out of South Carolina? Does anybody other than Joe Biden have a ticket out of South Carolina? I think he's got to have a pretty good night if he's going to stay in the race. And frankly, even if he does have a good night, I don't really know particularly where he goes from here. It could be sort of an Amy Klobuchar situation where even if he has a good night, that might not necessarily parlay into anything later down the road. What's your take on Steyer this evening, Shore, and what he needs to do to sort of remain relevant, if anything at all?
Well, I think it's a fair question. And for Steyer, it seems like he had been definitely making a play focusing on more predominantly African American counties in South Carolina. He had picked up a respectable number of endorsements. at the state level. And so I think for Steyer, his play was probably weakened by Biden's kind of resurgence in the last week or two. His long-term play was probably if Biden slides coming into South Carolina, maybe he can pick up the mantle in some of those predominantly African American counties. With Biden kind of picking up steam, that door seems to have closed and it's left him more on the outside looking in. But those are the counties we're going to be watching. If the margins we expect hold up, it will be a tough night for Steyer and one that probably will have him thinking about his thinking about his life choices. But in the meantime, we have to see how close does he get to Biden in some of these counties, or is he way behind and closer to the rest of the pack?
Yeah, I mean, does Bloomberg take over the billionaire lane come Tuesday? Like, is this just Steyer having fun? It is pretty interesting. I mean, Steyer has spent about $4 million on broadcast TV spends in this current calendar year so far, and in second place in South Carolina happens to be Michael Bloomberg, spending $1.2 million, and he's not even running. Or he's not even on the ballot in the state, and that was just essentially by mistake because of the way media markets are. Was spending a lot of money in the state, even though he's not even on the ballot. And so, whether or not these ads necessarily translate into vote shares, obviously there are a lot of skeptics out there. In Michael Bloomberg's case, we had seen that he was spending millions and millions and millions of dollars, especially on these Super Tuesday states, and his vote share in the polls had gone up pretty substantially. However, after his debate debuts, it looks like he's taken a little bit of a hit at the polls. But I don't know. Actually, Austin, can we pull up the national polling slide and then we can take a look at the state of the race nationally at the bottom?
Yes. And while Austin pulls that up, oh, he's already got it. But I was just going to say that I think tonight's result, obviously we were talking about what it tells you about Steyer. I think it also might say a lot about what Bloomberg's path is, because if Biden is able to really use this as a way to consolidate support among more traditional Democratic coalition members, I think that might close the door a bit on Bloomberg. If Biden is able to kind of pick up steam going into Super Tuesday, if Bloomberg sinks a little bit, maybe below that 15% delegate threshold in a handful of states, that might be curtains for Bloomberg. And so I think tonight's result is going to be important for Bloomberg looking forward.
Yeah, and I mean, in that vein, our president just tweeted out, "Sleepy Joe Biden's victory in the South Carolina Democrat primary should be the end of Mini Mike Bloomberg's joke of a campaign." After the worst debate performance in the history of presidential debates, Mini Mike has now has Biden split up to his very few voters, taking many away, and so this could be. Is Trump scared of Bloomberg? I don't really follow here, but I think Trump's sort of making the same argument that we are about, well, if Joe Biden's doing pretty well, then there might not be that much space for both Bloomberg and Biden in that so-called moderate lane come Super Tuesday. But we wanted to kind of pivot a little bit to national polling, as it's still a little bit too early for us to extrapolate anything from the results. Although, for those who are tuning in, we have called the race for Joe Biden. Vice President Joe Biden is the winner, according to Decision Desk HQ, of the South Carolina Democratic primary. However, we are paying attention to what the margin of victory and what some of these vote shares are going to be looking like through the evening. And so right now on the stream is Matt Shore and myself, Alex Podkul, and we're just taking a look at some of the national Democratic primary polling that we have here. And Sanders, really with a huge increase in the polls, especially coming out of New Hampshire, Iowa, and New Hampshire. He's doing pretty well, and there's quite a bit of distance between Sanders and everybody else. However, he is still hovering at 30%, and so he seems to be favoring from this fragmented Democratic presidential field. But now we're looking, if we look at the dark blue line, we have Biden there, the red line, Bloomberg. They were getting a little bit close in some of the national primary polling, but especially over the last week, we've seen that downward tick of Michael Bloomberg's primary polling. However, some of the immediate bounces, or at least that immediate hit in the first debate, he seems to have recovered a little bit. So it's still sort of an open question as to where Bloomberg's going to sit when we start counting the vote on Super Tuesday. But tonight we're not even talking about Bloomberg because he's not even on the ballot. But it seems to be everybody's thinking about where Joe Biden can go next now that we've declared that Joe Biden is the winner of the South Carolina Democratic primary.
And to jump in on this national polling question, I think two folks that we haven't really talked a lot about tonight who both had claims to momentum earlier are Buttigieg and Klobuchar. Biden resurgence rather obviously seems to hurt their chances at maybe consolidating some support, showing that they're the future of the party. But what did they get out of South Carolina? Both of them would seem to have an uphill battle in majority black counties. In South Carolina, a lot of the bigger cities we were looking at, counties with bigger cities and more suburbs in them, larger white populations. We're going to see how it shakes out, but we'll see if they're able to have a foothold there. Warren as well, I should mention, in that vein, or if Sanders kind of can clear the field a little bit in those communities. And I think that it's just fascinating to me that, I mean, Buttigieg wins the Iowa caucuses allegedly with some shenanigans given the final results, and Klobuchar, surprises in New Hampshire. That was enough for Bill Clinton to claim to be the comeback kid in 1992, coming in second, but doing better than expected. And so that kind of momentum, it just seems to have fizzled. And from a resources standpoint, you just have to wonder if they have the organization to compete in a big way on Super Tuesday. And Biden having a strong performance tonight makes it even harder for them to consolidate those kinds of resources. But I'll kick it to Drew. Drew, you have something to tell us about delegates.
Yeah, we've made our first projection based on the projection that Biden will win tonight. We're saying he has already accumulated 16 delegates from winning the South Carolina primary. Just to remind everybody, there are 54 pledged delegates that are up for grabs tonight. And so far, we are saying that Joe Biden has 160 in them. We expect that count to go up as we get more of the vote in. You have to remember, not only is this based on statewide vote share, but also on the 7 congressional districts within South Carolina. So once we start to see those fill in, once we do that, we'll be able to see what's going on with those congressional district level delegates. So 16 delegates right now for Joe Biden, which is a pretty healthy haul for him, considering what he's done in the previous contests.
Yeah, and it looks like we've got about 2,000 votes in from York County. Still not much considering we're expecting something closer to about 16, 17,000 votes in that county. But it is about greater than 75% white county, higher relative income, and Biden is at about 46%, Sanders behind him at about 19. That would be quite a margin for Biden in a county that would seem to have been on the weaker side for him in a state like South Carolina. If he's running up a margin like that, and again, it's early, there's only about 2,000 votes in from that county at the moment, but that would seem to be a very, very promising sign for Biden. If he's got a margin like that in a predominantly white, higher relative income county.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, already with those 16 delegates, that propels Biden to second place. I think a lot of people, when they were talking about Buttigieg's chances in the race, or at least even the Buttigieg campaign, was just pointing to saying, "Well, look how well we're doing in terms of the delegates," and it looks like, I mean, if the 16 delegates that have already been projected, if that trend continues through the evening, then it looks like Mayor Pete's argument sort of goes out the window a little bit as to, well, I could beat Bernie. Look at my delegate count. Where now it looks like that argument could be taken up by the Biden campaign.
Yeah, I think one thing we're definitely going to see tonight, as these results come in, depending on the size of the victory, this is really going to reset the race. It's really interesting to think how Joe Biden was sort of left by the wayside just a week or two ago. And if he comes back strong tonight, and this has been his argument all along, right? This is not entirely out of the blue, that South Carolina, a strong connection with African American voters who play a huge role in this primary in the Democratic Party in South Carolina, were going to be his firewall. As of the way it's looking right now, he was right. And then the question becomes, what's next? Does this become more of a two-man race? It's hard to see. I don't think anybody's going to drop out tonight, because why bother? There's less than 72 hours until we get to Super Tuesday. But certainly, I think there's going to be a bigger shakeout of the field come Wednesday morning. And depending on how things go on Tuesday, Biden's certainly going to have the ability to say, look, this is what I said was going to happen, and it's happening.
Well, and I think it also becomes an organization and a resource game at a certain point. And if you're Buttigieg, if you're Klobuchar, like Paikul was saying, you previously had a little bit of an argument to be made where you said, look at the delegate count. I'm winning. I am the guy who can kind of take this the distance. But once a state like South Carolina happens, and if the margins hold up the way we seem to suspect they will, that really hurts your argument if you're not the one who's leading by that kind of margin. And especially if we think about this in terms of lanes just for a second, we think about how it might block your momentum if you wanted to be that guy, but you're not the one who's kind of taking the reins in this situation. And so if you're Klobuchar, if you're Buttigieg, if you're Warren, but I'm specifically really thinking about Klobuchar and Buttigieg in this case, how do you build the organization? How do you gather the resources necessary to compete across the board, across the country on Super Tuesday, and in states like California with pretty expensive and pretty large media markets? It becomes a very difficult uphill battle just from a resource standpoint.
Absolutely. I mean, that's something that people were expecting to happen a little sooner, this idea about the field winnowing. And because of how the results have shaken out, and people were able to get a debate moment or two, which enabled them to do some fundraising. Also, in Klobuchar's case, translated to an actual surprise finish in an important primary in New Hampshire. But after that, where does it go? Even if you look at what's coming up on Super Tuesday for some of these candidates, some of Elizabeth Warren, I would think it's safe to say he really has to win Massachusetts. Bernie Sanders is obviously playing very hard there, only showing him doing very well. Amy Klobuchar is certainly going to look towards Minnesota, her home state, where she represents in the Senate. But even if they can win those states, the question becomes, what's the next step? I would think for Klobuchar, it's looking towards Michigan and Ohio the week after. She's going to make her pitch that she's going to be the Midwestern candidate, the candidate going back some of those Rust Belt states that Trump was able to win in 2016. But it gets harder to look at what happens with Warren. If she can't win in Massachusetts, then you really look at it and say, what's the path here? It's just hard to see that. But again, it's still early in this. The real question, I think, becomes what happens to Mike Bloomberg. Does he stay here? He came in sort of as the I will be here if Biden falls candidate. Their fates were sort of intertwined. As Biden shrank, Bloomberg went up. Well, if Biden comes back up, does that mean Bloomberg's going to fall back down? Then what's his plan? He certainly has the money to stay in. That's not a question. But to what end becomes the question, I think.
Yeah, and I think that thinking about Super Tuesday kind of handicapping those states, I think you're absolutely right that home state performance is going to be crucial for Warren in Massachusetts and Klobuchar in Minnesota. But interestingly enough, I mean, the most recent polling seems to have Sanders within the margin of error of Warren in Massachusetts. But I think that people tend to think of Warren maybe as having more potential as the overall nominee in terms of kind of bringing the wings of the party together and maybe performing a little bit better in certainly Iowa and Nevada. But Klobuchar is still, I think, something like 6 or 8 points ahead in the latest polls in Minnesota ahead of Sanders, but maybe she seems like the candidate in more of a precarious situation outside of that. So it seems almost paradoxical in some ways, where the candidate between the two of them who seems to have the easier road ahead in their home state has the harder one ahead outside of it, and vice versa.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, totally unrelated to anything. Sure. Do you want to teach us about collective action problems?
Well, and I think that it's an interesting thing not to, you know, become too too vague, but maybe too in the clouds. But you know, in this kind of a process, we're sitting here thinking about, well, if this candidate drops out, does it help that one? What does that mean for who might be the nominee? Certainly, candidates and their campaigns are just as aware, definitely more aware of these kinds of considerations than we are. But there's really no incentive for candidates to get out of the way, given the way that the system works. I mean, for Warren, I mean, I think that some of the, and this is really me just spitballing, but I think that some of the logic of staying in the race long term is, well, if it comes down to, Sanders and Biden, or Sanders and Bloomberg, or Sanders and some kind of more moderate variety, um, and that's who goes towards the convention as the two kind of bigger plurality leaders. But Warren is still there, has a handful of delegates, is still active. Well, maybe she can position herself at a convention as one of the rare candidate who can kind of satisfy both parts of the party. Um, so I mean, I just think that it's a fascinating question of, does this process incentivize candidates to put kind of the coalitional interests of the party first, or do you really just kind of pursue your own interest and kind of let the chips fall where they may?
Yeah, and we're just to those tuning in, we're just watching the South Carolina Democratic presidential primary. We called the race for Vice President Joe Biden pretty early on, and right now we're watching some of the votes trickle in. We have some votes from Spartanburg County, York County, from the northern part of the state, from Fairfield, which we got a little bit earlier. We have a big chunk of votes in from Berkeley there, where we have where Joe Biden had 58% of the vote right now, with Bernie Sanders, excuse me, in second place, with Tom Steyer behind him. Obviously, way too early for us to actually extrapolate anything about the overall margins between some of these candidates, but it also becomes a question as to, in terms of the raw math, yes, I think the margins are going to make a big deal. They're going to determine who walks out of here with what number of delegates. We've already said, as Drew was sharing before, we've estimated that Biden's going to walk out. As of right now, Biden's set with 16 of the state's delegates, and so far that's a pretty good haul. And we will see that number go up and up and up throughout the evening. But in terms of the overall margin, I think there's a serious question as to how much is the media narrative already set for those who are voting in Super Tuesday states. And so we mentioned in our Friday Around the Desk episode about how so many of the voters in these states have been voting early, but we are paying attention to what the overall election day vote share is going to be, and I think that that's going to be impacted pretty severely from today. But did Joe Biden already get the victory he needed by winning in the first place, or do we think that really it's going to come down to the margins here in determining who the winner was by the media or conventional wisdom standards?
Oh, I think you make a great point about how, in a lot of ways, Joe Biden has already won. Obviously we've called the win, but I think that he's won in the best way possible, right? We and other outlets called this, almost immediately for Biden. In that sense, it gives the impression that it's an overwhelming win. It's an obvious win, and that sets him up to give, a rollicking speech tonight. All of the media talking heads will have no bones about it that Biden is the clear winner in South Carolina, even before they really get to dig into any kind of numbers, if they ever dig into any kind of numbers. And so I think from a media narrative perspective, this really couldn't have gone much better for him. For Sanders, it's a missed opportunity to maybe clear the field a little bit and establish yourself as the clear front runner. But I guess it's a whole other conversation about what this might mean for Sanders on Super Tuesday and what this means for him maybe collecting delegates. But that's a conversation for down the line. But just to answer your point, I think tonight has already been a dream for Joe Biden. It's also his first primary win ever. So congratulations to Joe Biden on accomplishing that.
That's right. This is his third run overall. He didn't make it to Iowa the first time. He dropped out right after Iowa the second time. So this is his fifth contest, and he's finally won one. So yeah, I wonder if that's some sort of record for a candidate. But yeah, he has to be thrilled. His campaign has to be thrilled, and I think you're going to see a whole bunch of endorsements. You're going to see a lot of fundraising going on around this. He's not been sort of the online juggernaut that the other candidates have, but I think you're going to see a lot of high dollar Democrats that were originally expected to line up behind him starting to show up again, because obviously his campaign is in a significantly better spot today than it was just a day or two ago.
Yeah, and I think I'm I'm sitting here in my head thinking, well, he first ran in 1988 and it's now 2020. So has anybody run for president and then taken that long to actually win their first nomination contest? And I think he has the record. I'm struggling to think. I think Ron Paul ran for the first time for something in 1988 for president. I think he was maybe the Libertarian nominee.
Right.
But I don't think he ever won. Did he ever win a contest?
Well,
I know.
depends on how you define win, right? Didn't he wind up winning, in air quotes here, the Iowa caucus one year because of how the delegate allocation went? If you could lose the night of, but then if you showed up at the county and then the state level, you could actually come out with more delegates. That was something that both parties, put an end to pretty quickly. So I don't think he
Yeah.
ever did first. If he did, sure somebody in the chat will tell us that. But I think sort of the story is that we're doing Joe Biden filler material 43 minutes after the polls close. Really gives you a sense of what a big night it is for him. This is now just sort of a watch to see how big the lead becomes, and also how big the delegate haul is for him. But yeah, this has got to be a very exciting night for Biden and for people that support him. And quite frankly, people that were just worried about Bernie Sanders. It certainly exists within the Democratic Party.
Well, and if you were one of the people who was concerned about Sanders, does this maybe? I mean, obviously, it satisfies you if you were concerned about Sanders and you just wanted him to be denied some delegates at some point. But if you're someone who is concerned about Sanders and looking for kind of an anti-Sanders alternative, or at least a non-Sanders alternative, does tonight kind of give you a convincing enough result that you say, you know what, Biden's that guy? Forget, Buttigieg, Klobuchar, forget all of that. Biden's the anti-Sanders, and so we've got to coalesce around that.
I think you're going to, because I think in their heart of hearts, that's what a lot of them wanted to do. I think that's what a lot of them expected to do. I think if you talk to Democrats, people that are professionals at this, 6 months ago, they weren't planning on Joe Biden having to fight for his life in South Carolina. I remember when those stories started coming out and saying, "Oh, this is my firewall." There were a lot of people going, this is kind of early to talk about firewall, guys. Why aren't you talking about winning New Hampshire? Why aren't you competing there? Why aren't you talking about winning Iowa? Um, there's also a history of we'll get them 3 races in or 4 races in. That's not terribly strong. It's hard to do it this way. But I think, again, the dynamics of this field, the dynamics of how campaigns are done now, you have that viral moment, raised $9 million in 2 days, has changed what's possible and what was thought was possible. And yeah, so I do think if you're a Democratic poobah, to the extent those things exist anymore, you're not you're not feeling the burn. You are definitely looking at this and saying, okay, I feel sick. This guy's going to carry the banner. He's alive. He's doing what he had to do. Yeah, let's see how everybody feels come Wednesday, because we have seen this race and the dynamics of this primary campaign change very quickly. Um, you know, there's still scenarios where Bloomberg's $500 million actually did buy him something in early votes that are already banked before this news hits. Um, we'll have to see, but I think this is definitely going to be a long slog. And don't forget, there are still states coming up next week. And I think you were just talking about this a little earlier, where Sanders is still doing well. Very well. He's doing very well in California, according to polls. And a lot of votes are in there. Right now it's him and Elizabeth Warren is the only other candidate, she barely in polling, that's going to be viable statewide. Now there's congressional districts, so there'll be people that are viable in different districts. But, does Joe Biden suddenly, pop up into 25, 30% of California? He's going to win some states. He's going to do well in other states. But California's a big prize.
Yeah, and I think, I just find it very interesting that this strategy of, and probably wasn't an intentional one, but this strategy of, well, we'll kind of suffer through the first handful of states, and then we'll get to one that will really clean up in, and it'll reestablish us. I mean, you were talking about how in the past it didn't really work for anyone. Certainly in 2008, it didn't work for Rudy Giuliani, who tried to kind of put all of his eggs in the Florida basket that year, and seemed to basically forfeit the first handful of states. Bloomberg is trying the same thing in a way, passing on the first 4 primaries and then jumping in on Super Tuesday. And, it's a strategy, like you said, that just hasn't historically been very successful. But this time it looks like Biden might have, at least for the moment, breathed new life into his campaign by a very strong showing in South Carolina. And so, as you can see, we've got some results slowly trickling in from South Carolina. Joe Biden, already the projected winner there, got about over 8,000 votes at the moment. A clear majority of the small handful of votes we have so far. We don't want to read too much into those quite yet until we start getting our sample size way up higher. But at the moment, definitely a win for Joe Biden, giving him the win he desperately needed to reassert himself in this race after disappointing showings in Iowa and New Hampshire. We were talking, Drew, about the kind of outlook going forward for Sanders on Super Tuesday. I think that we probably will agree that tonight's result doesn't hurt him among his own supporters. So do we think that, how do we think that bodes for him on Super Tuesday? Do we think he probably still is the safest bet to meet the delegate threshold across the board, across different states? Or do you think that maybe this puts a dent in him a little bit? Or do you think that maybe a Biden resurgence maybe puts him on the run a little bit?
Well, I think it can't but help Biden, certainly. I think it's a question of degree at this point. Um, one thing we've also seen with a lot of voters that have gone to the polls at this point in the race has been support's been tentative and quick to change. And so if people were looking for a sign, there were some stories out of North Carolina that early voting was very high, and one of the theories people really wait until the last minute. That's something that's interesting about a lot of early voting in primaries, where you have a large field, you have people waiting for different things, candidates are looking for. Polling has shown continuously that Democrats, their main issue is who can beat Trump in November. So people are watching these candidates to do that. That's why I think we're seeing debates have such an impact. And so if people get the sense of that and there maybe isn't a ton of early voting or as much as there could have been, then I think this actually would have a great deal of help for Biden. I think Biden certainly wants to get this to be a one-on-one race as quickly as possible. I think Sanders probably would prefer a larger field, or certainly he wouldn't mind Elizabeth Warren dropping out if he could then take some of those votes that may be more natural supporters of his. And you would like to see Bloomberg and Biden kind of battle it out a little longer. But given the number of delegates that are up for grabs on Super Tuesday, Biden and Bloomberg, even if they're just, it's a difference between 10% or 20% going either way. Once they start to divide that pie, and if Bernie supporters stick with him and he does well, like he looked in California or something, again, the idea is I think you're going to see those models start to say nobody wins the majority, starts to become the candidate.
Yeah, thanks. I think I think one of the things especially that we're going to be looking at is even Biden's performance relative to his polls. So like we have the Real Clear Politics average. Wait, I don't know. We're getting a delay. No, like sorry, we're dealing with a quick technical difficulty. Sorry about that issue.
Well, I can say at the moment, what is interesting, just looking at the results that we've got rolling in, Biden is the leader in every county so far. And again, it's early. We've still got a lot of votes left to look at. But at the moment, Biden has a lead in every county that we've got results in. What is also very interesting is who's coming in second in many of these counties, right? So statewide, Sanders is in second place at the moment. But in a handful of these counties, it's Steyer who's coming in second place. Some of the counties that are interesting at the moment, you've got Florence County, right? Florence County is slightly above the state average on educational attainment, income, and it's also slightly younger than average. And in that county, Biden is ahead, and Steyer is the one he's coming in a distant second, but it's Steyer who's in second there, not Sanders. And again, early, only about 3,500 votes counted there. We expect probably about 10,000 more to come in from Florence County. But an interesting kind of result. Some counties where you would think maybe Sanders could be more competitive. One where we've got about 2,800 votes in right now, and we expect something on something on around 20,000 votes more to go in Spartanburg County. Another one that's above the state average on education and income and slightly younger than the state average. And in Spartanburg right now, it's Biden at about 53%, and Steyer is in second around 15, not Sanders. And so it's interesting there, where, of course, there's a lot more to go. But at the moment, it's Biden holding a commanding lead in all of the counties we've got results in. And in a few of these, many of them, Sanders is in second, and that's why he's second statewide. But a few of them, Steyer is actually giving Sanders a run for his money for second place in some counties where you would think demographically Sanders might actually be doing a little bit better than he is.
Yeah, and we're gonna watch that pretty closely. And on the screen right now, again, we have the Decision Desk HQ election results map as we're watching some of the vote trickle in. If you're just joining us, we did call the election for Vice President Joe Biden, but if you're tuning in right now, I doubt that you're tuning in for the top line takeaway. But if you're here, you're probably election nerd. Like the rest of us, as we're trying to figure out who takes away the most delegates from tonight, what the margin of victory for Joe Biden is. I mean, if this were, let's say, hypothetically, let's say the current result were the end of the night, right? Let's say Biden passed 50%, Bernie is kept under 15%, albeit just barely. Um, Obviously, this is a terrible exercise because we're way over extrapolating on the little amount of vote that we currently have in. But let's say just for a thought exercise, if this were the result, what would be your hot take?
Well, I think, like I was saying, what's fascinating to me is that there are a handful of counties where Steyer is holding second place at the moment, and you would think they would be counties where Sanders would probably be doing a little bit better. Maybe not winning those counties outright, but maybe doing a little bit better. Um, and so it's interesting to me that uh, obviously Biden holding such a commanding lead in most of these places, actually every county at this point, is the story, and I think Biden got that boost of positive attention once everybody called this race for him, a minute in. But I'm just kind of surprised at some of the places where Steyer has really been able to make inroads. Um, Not necessarily at the expense of Sanders, but definitely in some places where you would expect Sanders to do a little bit better. Um, if you look at Charleston County, for example, the College of Charleston is there. So college campuses tend to be good news for Sanders. Again, very cautious here because there's only about 2,200 votes in, and we expect something on the order of over 40,000 more votes to come in there. But at the moment, it's Biden at about 60% and Sanders only pulling about 15. Um, and that's probably not a good margin in a county where it's got the highest education of any county in South Carolina. It's got higher income, and it's got that college campus, so it's a somewhat younger county. Um, Even Richland, we don't have anything right now, but if that margin shows up there where they have the University of South Carolina, it could be a long night for Sanders. If he comes in behind Steyer in a handful of these places, I think that it could raise a lot of questions about how broad Sanders' appeal can be outside of maybe his core supporters, which is a concern that maybe more establishment Democrats have been voicing lately.
Yeah, and as we close out our first hour, I guess now is a good time to remind everybody to make sure to like, subscribe, follow, whatever it is, on Twitch, YouTube, Periscope, Facebook. Did I say Twitter in there? Whatever it is, be sure to like, follow, subscribe. We do these election night commentaries for each of the big races, and as we go on throughout the election cycle. Once the presidential gets settled, we'll still be here for the tight gubernatorial and Senate races and the important things. So make sure to like, follow, and subscribe for to keep getting this election commentary. Additionally, even before and after these races, we'll often do episodes of what we call the Around the Desk show, where we'll give some previews and autopsies of what happens in these elections. So be sure to check out that for continued election night resources here from Decision Desk HQ. If you're just tuning in now, what took you so long? But right now, we've called the race for Vice President Joe Biden very early in the night. What we're paying attention to, I think we're pretty much all agreed that there are, I guess, three different things we're paying attention to. One is who the overall top line winner is, and we know that. The second is whether or not, or just what that margin is between Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders, and whether or not this is the commanding lead that we're being led to believe that it is. And I guess the third point, and which is arguably the most important, is who's walking out of here with the delegates. And so as of right now, Decision Desk HQ has already given 16 delegates to Joe Biden, and so the current delegate count coming out of Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, and now South Carolina, pending the rest of the state, is Bernie in the lead with 45, but Joe Biden has overtaken former South Bend Mayor Pete Buttigieg to take that second place in the delegate spot. Mayor Pete not doing super well tonight. Very likely that he doesn't walk out of here with any delegates. And if there is this, Shore before said if we have to talk about it in terms of a moderate lane or so on and so forth. I mean, even if we don't break it out into ideological lanes, I think another way of thinking about it is there's Bernie versus the world. And if we're looking at that, the world lane, I think Joe Biden might be making a strong case for himself over Mayor Buttigieg. What do we I guess this is for whoever wants to take it. What do we think really got Joe Biden to this point so far with this victory? Was it the big endorsements that he's gotten? Was it his debate performance? Was it just all he had to do in a debate was go over his allotted time? Was that enough for him to actually win a contest? What do we think was the difference? Because the tide was not going in his direction as we were leaving, especially in New Hampshire. Was it Nevada? Was it the endorsements? Was it the debate? What do we think it was that gets us to the conversation we're having now?
I think in large part it was the debate, but not nearly the whole part of it. Joe Biden's a well-known brand. He's been around a long time. In South Carolina, and we've talked about it endlessly, the African-American vote is very important, and he has deep ties there. He has deep roots that go back a long way, and that matters. It matters when you're going to specific communities, and people want to know that you know them. You're not just showing up. You're not a flash in the pan. You've been there. You have a history. And I think we saw that in early polling. It was reflected. I think then there was the dip where maybe he wasn't doing as well, wasn't as sharp as people had wanted him to be. He took some hits, and people kind of questioned that. And then they start to see him coming back, and they see that he's, the guy they thought he was. And there's a comfort level. Again, this is something we talked about a little earlier. This is what Biden and his team had been saying all along. This was his firewall. Now, you don't want to have to say 3 months out, we have a firewall. You want to be saying we're winning everywhere. But he knew this state. He knew the people there. They knew him. And I think whatever he did, whether it be that one debate or the way he had conducted himself since not having those very good results in Iowa and New Hampshire, I think it reassured them all across the state that he's the guy they thought he was. And we're starting to see him be back to where those polling numbers were. So I don't think it's out of the blue. I just think the anomaly was that middle period where, he just didn't have strong performances either in debates or at polling time. And once he started to show a little life and reminded people why they liked him and were in favor of him in the first place, they came home to him.
I also think it may be a story of missed opportunities for some potential replacements. You think about Buttigieg, you think about Klobuchar, and you think about the opportunities they maybe had to seize some momentum. And in a lot of ways, they kind of fell flat after their big moments. Is that a story of just not being able to gather enough resources to really scale up their campaigns? Is it a story of maybe just not connecting with certain groups of voters? It's kind of unclear, but at the very least, I think this is a very different race if Pete Buttigieg is able to, leave Iowa with a clear win, roll into New Hampshire, clearly win there, do decently in Nevada, maybe this is a different race, or maybe we don't think it is because he just can't connect with the voters in South Carolina. So I think that in a lot of ways, maybe this is a story of people coming back home, but it might be because they sampled other flavors and they just didn't like the taste.
Well, it's really hard when you're a new candidate on the national scene like Buttigieg is, or even Warren, who has a much larger brand, well known. Um, you're not you don't have the luxury of looking ahead to South Carolina, right? You have to survive. You're trying to survive Iowa. You're trying to survive New Hampshire. And so you can't really spend that time there building that. Yes, all these candidates go there and they go back and forth, but Buttigieg spent a lot of time in New Hampshire. He spent a lot of time in Iowa, and that's just a resource. You when you're a new person like that, you you can't make up for years. You can't make up for decades. Joe Biden can come in and he doesn't have to do 30 events so that people get to know him. He just has to do some events to remind them about him. And so he had that luxury. Of course, he was also focusing on that, I think, far more than anybody else, other than perhaps Tom Steyer, who, with his money, and we have to remember too, in Nevada and even in South Carolina, Steyer was the only one on the air. He was really having the field to himself. Well, that's why we saw some polling where he was in third place in Nevada, which obviously didn't pan out as the momentum of the race took a turn with people doing better, or they were able to start to focus at it. So I think there's just, time is a really precious resource in a campaign. And you can't make up for decades in a couple of weeks or a couple of months. And that's really what I think hurt some of these other candidates.
Yeah, that's a good point. It just becomes a resource game, really, as to how wide could your campaign be? As much as we sort of talk about how the presidential primary contest, how is really just helps have this retail politics where you go state to state and you talk to the different voters and so on and so forth. When we have a calendar that keeps things so close together, where we're a week away from Nevada and we have 72 hours until Super Tuesday. It's not that retail politics. You need to be able to run in multiple states at the same time, and some of these candidates just didn't seem to be up to the task of running also in South Carolina alongside some of these early states. And as we were mentioning before, I'm pretty fascinated about how it was a week and a half ago where everybody kept talking about Amy Klobuchar, and that just hasn't really turned into anything at all.
I think you can say the same thing about Buttigieg. Just turn the clock back an extra week.
Yeah. That's a good point.
I mean, it's really two candidates who have done the things that we tend to think are the things that give you momentum in this process, and it just didn't really materialize. It was not really carried forward. But I mean, if you think about this process, you say, well, once the voting starts, what do you do to kind of help your cause? Well, you say, beat expectations, win contests, um, do better than expected. Um, and these are the kinds of examples that we kind of emphasize when we think about this process. We think all the way back to Jimmy Carter in 1976. He wins Iowa, he starts stringing together wins, and suddenly he's the Democratic nominee. All the way up, I mean, the whole way we think about this cycle in a lot of ways is, well, you do better than expected. You in 1992, you're Bill Clinton, and even though you come in second in New Hampshire, you beat expectations. So it doesn't matter that Paul Tsongas actually won. You were the de facto winner because you did better than expected, and you can declare yourself the comeback kid, and that can kind of help propel you forward. But it just doesn't seem like those things materialized for Buttigieg or for Klobuchar. So, I mean, Klobuchar way overperforming in New Hampshire, Buttigieg allegedly winning Iowa, and it just doesn't seem to have really mattered.
I think, though, we really can't overestimate South Carolina, and I know we talked about it. I know everybody's talked about it, about the African American vote. That is the base, the heart and soul of the Democratic Party. I know there's a lot of energy around Bernie's voters, but in terms of pure numbers, certainly in South Carolina, it's African American voters, and they have not had a chance to weigh in on this until tonight. And I think you're seeing what that means. Now there are going to be more states where um, other types of voters will be important as well. So that's why I think this will go on and on. But the idea that you could have a nominee who doesn't connect with that larger portion of the base of the party is something I think is unimaginable. It could happen. Sanders could also start to overperform. I think a lot of voters in South Carolina were giving him a look. If Biden hadn't come back, I don't necessarily think Steyer would have been the go-to person. I think there's, as again, all the polling was showing is who can beat Trump was really what was on voters' minds. But yeah, this is the reality of the types of states, the people that live in them, and we're just seeing different people do well in different areas, and that's going to play out over the course of probably the next couple of months. I don't know. Does anybody think this is suddenly going to coalesce and Sanders is going to fade away? I doubt that. It's not going to be a Clinton kind of case where Biden gets the lead and then just sort of drags it out and survives long enough, and you see the super delegates come into play. But it's not unexpected that different parts of the coalition are going to coalesce around different candidates, and now we're going to see the relative strength of those portions of the coalition play out.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a fair point to kind of pump the brakes on our conversation a little bit, not to kind of think through, well, now that South Carolina happened, clearly Joe Biden is the, obvious favorite for the entire Democratic nomination. But I do think that if you're a Sanders campaign supporter, this is a disappointing night for you, not necessarily because you didn't win, but also because I think you were probably hoping to make it close. You were hoping to be able to show, well, even if we didn't win, this is a tough state for us demographically, but we did okay. What I'm not sure exactly what the threshold would have been to make that claim, but based on what we're seeing, and again, it's early and things may change as more numbers come in, but at the moment, I think it would be very difficult for Sanders to claim that this was anything but a bad night. Um, it's a core constituency of the Democratic Party, and not that you necessarily need to be their first choice, but I think that to make the case that you're the obvious, presumptive front runner and you have the path to the nomination locked up, I think you probably need to have a stronger performance than what Sanders was able to muster tonight.
Yeah, these are all good points. I mean, I think it's interesting that we're pointing to the Clinton example. I think another example that especially the popular media has been making is trying to compare this race to 2016. And part of it is just by the number of candidates in the race and looking at some of the different dynamics at play there. It's just been an interesting comparison. Plus, I think people have relatively short-term memories, and so we're just comparing it to the race that's immediately before us. But I think one of the things that makes this race stand out is in 2016, Trump was ahead in the polls pretty much the entire time. There was a brief moment on the Real Clear Politics average where Carson was neck and neck with him, but otherwise, he pretty much had the commanding victory. After Ted Cruz walked out of Iowa, he went up in the polls, but as did Trump. And so Trump was just always in the lead. But yet this time around, Biden was in the lead. And some of us were speculating going into the beginning of the primaries that that it would be relatively unexciting. That is, it could just be Biden's winning. But the difference is in the national polling, we did see Bernie overtake Biden. And so I think it's an interesting case here to to see how fickle, I guess, some of the primary voters may be as they're looking for a candidate here. Biden may be back, and I think it's right that for us to be maybe throwing some cold water on the finding tonight, especially since we're still awaiting what some of those margins are going to look like once we get a greater percentage of the vote share in. But I think there's also a case to be said, well, Sanders is still in the national polling doing quite well.
Yeah, I don't mean to, imply that somehow this is a, major impediment to Sanders going forward. But if you were his campaign, I think that you were hoping you wouldn't have to explain away coming in behind Steyer in majority black counties. That's a difficult position to be in as the, making the argument that you should be the standard bearer of the Democratic Party.
Yeah, the idea that you could do that would be almost unthinkable just in terms of the mass of winning the Democratic nomination. But then the implications of that going into November against Donald Trump, that if you don't have significant and enthusiastic support among African American voters, you're going to be in some big trouble. Now, obviously, there's states where, like South Carolina, probably are not in play come November, certainly Alabama or Mississippi, where a lot of these voters make up the majority of the party. But we saw what happened in Wisconsin with African American voters, and certainly in Michigan. So the idea that you could just skip on by that, I think is probably foolhardy. It's hard to imagine going into that kind of contest without your base solidly and enthusiastically behind you. So that's something that's going to happen. Now you wonder, okay, if beating Trump is the most important thing, do they turn out for, whether they say it's any blue or something like that, whoever's blue. But how far does that get you? Does that get you the enthusiasm you need, the people that are going to go out and pump up the vote and be sure people show up on the day of? That kind of relationship with your base is very important, and that's something I think the Sanders campaign knows they're going to have to work on, and they're going to have to have an explanation for, certainly going forward, about how they can match that challenge should he become the nominee.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, thinking in the longest term strategy, thinking about the general election, certainly you want to be turning more voters, more of your base out in Detroit, in Philadelphia, in Milwaukee. Those kind of things are important, but it's even important in some other swing states. You think about North Carolina, you think about Virginia, which is on the table. You think about Florida. There are different reasons that maybe we think these states are or aren't, more competitive, but these are constituencies that are part of your base, and turning them out is important. And the fact that even, at least in the very, very initial numbers we have here tonight, you can't even really rely on the inevitability factor buying you a lot of support in those counties. It's tough. I mean, it's a difficult position to be in, to be coming in behind Steyer in some of these counties. I mean, we'll see if that holds up as more votes come in, but it's a difficult, it's a precarious position for the Sanders campaign to be in. You were hoping to be able to make the claim of inevitability, of a wider appeal. If you can't get out of South Carolina being able to reasonably claim either of those things, and you get shellacked on the top line, what can you leave here with the argument of?
I think you're going to have to look at, I think the argument comes, well, we're going to better places, right? They're going to say, look at California. Come talk to us after California. Come talk to us after we do well. Hopefully, if you're the Sanders campaign, you're saying, come talk to us after we do well in Massachusetts. The week after that, This is where I think the really interesting battle becomes is when you get into Michigan and Ohio. This is the idea. Okay, where's the path lead to win in November? And there's sort of two prongs to it that Sanders and most Democrats I think talk about, which is you're going to try and flip back places like Pennsylvania, places like Michigan, places well probably less Ohio, Wisconsin, or do you go after new places where Democrats haven't won very recently, Georgia and Arizona being the top kind of markets, and you had mentioned North Carolina being another target. And so I think they're going to say, let's go see how we do there. Now you have to be careful because winning a partisan primary in a state isn't exactly going to be the same as winning it in November. Again, South Carolina is not a state that the Democrats, no matter who the nominee is, are going to put a nickel into. Um, obviously in the Senate races and things like that, but as far as the presidency, that's just not going to be on the table. Neither will Alabama, neither will Mississippi. I think one place that people will talk about, and maybe how the outcome of it does affect it, and it may be somewhat of a long shot. I think probably more of a long shot than Democrats think, and probably not as long a shot as Republicans would hope, would be Texas. Because you have sort of a double whammy there. You have a large Latino population, but you also have a large, increasingly disaffected from the Republican Party suburban vote there. So I think there might be a case to say, well, this is an area where we did well. But California, okay, great. Bernie Sanders may run the table. That's going to be a big number for his delegates. I guarantee you that anybody that is running on the Democratic side is going to win California come November. So the ability to say, well, we did well in these states will translate to November, I think is tenuous at best, but I think that's the argument you're going to start to hear from people as they move into these other states.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting the way that people are kind of looking toward the electoral map for the general election, and thinking about, well, how each of these possible candidates, possible nominees for the Democrats would fare maybe slightly differently. Obviously, a lot of the map is kind of locked in just based on partisanship, but which kinds of doors are a little bit more open for one candidate and which, kind of doors are maybe a little bit more closed. And I think from what I've heard, and, maybe others have kind of seen differently, but among what I've seen, the wisdom of the crowd seems to be that Sanders rather would fare slightly worse in a Florida and a Pennsylvania, but would probably fare better in an Arizona or even a Texas. That a Texas could be more in play for Sanders. So, Drew, I think you're right that some of these kinds of arguments, based on these kinds of calculations, are going to come into play of saying, well, look, we look how well we did in the primaries in these states, and that's going to translate, and we're going to do better in these places in the general if we nominate this candidate. Empirically, those kinds of claims are tenuous, but they still probably will be made. But I do think it's an interesting point of, some of these nominees. I mean, do we think that I've heard a lot about how Sanders would fare better in Texas or Arizona, but might fare worse in Florida or Pennsylvania. Biden, we would imagine, would probably do better in Pennsylvania. It's kind of his second home state. Maybe would do better in Florida, but do we really think that Florida would be that much more in play for him than Sanders? I mean, I guess, in other words, what I'm asking is, do we think that the candidate choice is going to affect the electoral map as much as maybe we think it is just kind of sitting around at the moment? Or do we think that partisanship is going to end up really driving the car for the most part? I mean,
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Short. And I think there might be two answers. I think the first answer is if we think about it in terms of just what the national vote share is. And the reason why I bring up that point is we look at a lot of national head-to-head polls where pollsters will ask respondents whether if the election were today, would you vote for Trump and they rotate a bunch of Democrat names. And time after time after time, there's no statistical significance across these Democratic candidates. That is, it's within the margin of error how well Joe Biden does relative to Bernie. Now that's not true in every poll that's happened, but especially of late, it looks like a lot of that is pretty much baked in. However, I think the point that you're making is particularly how this is going to play out in the Electoral College. And so rather than looking at it from the national perspective, looking at it at these key battleground states, and you brought up sort of Florida as your example, and I think you're. I don't know. I could kind of see the argument both sides, but you got to think that maybe somebody like an Amy Klobuchar would play better in some of these Midwestern battleground states. However, there's also an argument that I mean, it seems like Bloomberg could potentially do pretty well in Florida. It looks like Sanders maybe threw away Florida with some of his comments recently, but I think it's an interesting thought experiment, because we do see that a lot of these general election head-to-head polls from this far out are actually pretty accurate in recent years. So this was not always the case, but especially in 2012 and in 2016, these polls have been pretty steady, even before we actually know who the nominee is going to be. But I think, sure, you raise a good point when we try and think about what this means for the different state level contests.
Yeah, and I think that if you put yourself in the shoes of like a cold, rational Democratic partisan whose one objective is to win the general election, and you're looking at the slate of potential candidates, and you're saying, okay, which one would kind of give us the most competitive electoral college map? And obviously, you brought up that Sanders maybe has forfeited some competitiveness in Florida with the Castro comments. Maybe he's forfeited some competitiveness in Pennsylvania and Ohio with kind of the declaration of support for a fracking ban. But if he gives you, as some of his supporters claim, if he gives you a wider map in the sense that he really blows the doors open for Arizona and for Texas, especially, if that's what you're looking at, maybe it's worth the trade. But I think that it's a question of, do you buy the argument that he can really be that much more competitive in those states than, say, a Biden or a Warren or whomever? And that's something that is a difficult argument to sell in a lot of ways. I think that in some ways these states tend to move together in interesting ways. And by the time a Texas or a Georgia or an Arizona would become seriously in play, you might have already lost a Florida and a Pennsylvania and a Michigan and a Wisconsin if you're the Republican candidate. So, I guess, do we buy that it's worth nominating Sanders and forfeiting some of these other states because he will open the door so much wider in the other ones? It's kind of do we believe in the change or in the continuity?
Well said, Shore. Well said. As always. If you're tuning in now, we called the race for Vice President Joe Biden a really long time ago. But we are watching very closely to see how the delegate math is going to break out, and also to see what that margin of victory looks like for Joe Biden over the presumed second place finisher, Bernie Sanders. And for fun, we're also taking a look at seeing how Tom Steyer is going to end up this evening as sort of a half-hourly check-in. Be sure to like, subscribe, Twitch, like us on Twitter, follow us on Twitter, like, subscribe on YouTube. I don't really know what all these things are, but you could figure it out.
Like our MySpace page.
Yeah, go on MySpace and make sure to add me on Friendster. So we are looking at some of the comments. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like us to raise, feel free to include those. Right now, we're just watching the vote sort of trickle in and looking at some of the key counties that Shore was talking about earlier. As the night goes on, we haven't made any other changes to the delegate math as of yet, just because we're waiting for some of these numbers to come in. But Joe Biden is in second place currently in the delegate tracker, behind Bernie Sanders, and leading former Mayor Pete Buttigieg, now with 31 delegates. This could turn out to be a really good night for Joe Biden. I mean, we already know it's going to be a good night. The question I think that we may be asking is, how good of a night is this for the vice president? And is this enough, or is it a little bit too late as voters go to the polls on Tuesday in way too many states, which is another reminder. Be sure to check out our stream on Tuesday night for Super Tuesday to get all the results as quickly as we can. But as we're sort of
cool.
Oh,
I
thanks,
was no, just gonna give the shout outs where they're due. That's Alexander Podcool. I'm Matt Shore. We've got Drew McCoy on here also. Tracking South Carolina. Still waiting for many more votes to trickle in, but trying to do what we can to read into what we have so far.
Yeah, be sure to interact with us on Twitter as well. We're watching that, so feel free to interact in using any of the 17 channels that we're currently streaming on.
Absolutely. You mentioned kind of watching the second place finishes and where that's going to go. I think it's interesting looking at specific counties and looking at which counties Sanders is dropping out of second place in. And so far, it looks like in every county where Biden's leading every county, and where Sanders is not in second, Tom Steyer is. Um, and those tend to be counties that are majority African American, but not exclusively those counties. So we'll see if that holds up as more votes come in. But like we were discussing a little bit before, if Sanders is struggling to beat out Steyer in some of these counties where demographically it might be a little bit more of an uphill battle for Sanders, it does dent his argument of broader appeal at most, and it probably dents his argument of inevitability as well.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I guess on the other side is the electability argument, right? And what this is, and how this electability, how winning tonight is going to help Joe Biden, if at all, going into Super Tuesday. What's your thought, Shore, on whether or not there's enough of a runway between now and Super Tuesday? Because I think there's a good argument to be had that there's a lot of votes that have already been cast in some of these Super Tuesday states, especially where there are large delegate halls to be had, such as in California or in Texas, where we've had a huge number of the early vote and the absentee vote, or the early vote or absentee by mail vote already out there. Do we think that maybe this is a little bit too late for some of those who are maybe voting in what I'm labeling the anyone but Sanders lane?
I think that's a good point. It's a question that came up in Nevada, where some folks felt like allowing early votes hurt Warren, who was coming off of a strong debate performance. And it's something that is a fair question in a campaign like a primary, where presidential primaries, where we have these kind of this piecemeal slate of state by state races, where it's such a dynamic campaign and things change daily. Early voting can maybe lock you into something that your feelings can change on pretty quickly, and then you're locked into that vote. And it's not a decision that for a lot of people is as stable as their partisan affiliation in a general election. You know, if you're a Republican or if you're a Democrat, you know almost with absolute certainty which way you're going to vote in the general election. And so an early vote makes a lot of sense for you. But in a primary like this, where things can change daily and you don't have partisanship to lean on in that way for your vote choice, every little thing can matter. And maybe early votes lock voters into something, and they can't adequately react to what happens the day before. Um, it's an interesting question, and I think that it's something that maybe a lot of Warren supporters had gripes over in Nevada, uh, because there was plenty of early voting there, and some of them felt like it stunted momentum that otherwise would have shown up in the vote totals.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think that yeah, I think that's a really good point. As we sort of we're making a lot of comments about the overall national race just as we're waiting for some of the votes to come in, because we really can't say too much more about the delegate allocation quite yet. And the race has been fairly static between just in terms of the relative vote shares that we're seeing so far. The map on the screen is Biden blue in pretty much every county where we're having votes so far. He's in our overall result just shy of the 50% threshold. Bernie Sanders is at around 18, 19% of the vote as it's coming in. But there's some interesting points. So if we look at, like, say, the CNN exit poll, Biden is doing pretty well even among groups that we might not have expected. So Biden, for example, even among the 30 to 44-year-olds, doing quite well, picking up 36% of that age cohort compared to Sanders' 28. Now, of course, Sanders got 43% of the vote among 17 to 29-year-olds, but Biden cleaning up with every other vote share. And among the 65 plus, about 2/3 of the vote share. And so I think if we had to tell the demographic story here, I think there are two pieces for South Carolina. The first is mostly we're talking about these age groups. And this is reflected pretty much nationally, where whenever we see these polls, if you just look at the age breakdown, Bernie does very well among the young voters, and then we've seen older voters sort of flip around, but especially in South Carolina, this has been a place where Biden has been surging. And then on the other demographic issue that we're looking at, I think pretty closely, is the African American vote. And so on the in the CNN exit polls, Biden leads among both white voters and African American voters, but it was a commanding lead among the African American voters who, according to their estimates, make up about 57% of the voting population there today. Among those African American voters, Biden picked up 64% of the vote. That's just a commanding lead over Bernie Sanders' 15% of the vote. Among white voters, as of right now, their exit poll is saying Joe Biden beat Sanders by about 9 percentage points. So it was a much more narrow, but Biden winning among both categories, but especially among the African American vote. As we're sort of watching some of the other votes trickle in, could you kind of remind us, I know we spoke about this earlier, but could you remind us of some of the key counties that you're looking at as the votes come in? Are there any regional breakdowns, or are we mostly looking at where these counties sit in terms of their demographic composition? Could you tell us what these key counties are and what some of the logic behind thinking of these as key counties are?
Absolutely. So one of the wonderful things for doing about doing this for Decision Desk HQ is the speed with which we get our results, and that allows us to be able to make insights like with about 97% of the precincts in Horry County, which is a county that is slightly above the state average on education and income, a little bit older than average, and only about 14% African American. In Horry County, we've got Biden up 44% with 44% of the vote. Sanders in second at about 22%. So Biden just about doubling up Sanders in Horry County. And that's a very interesting one. But I think that to answer your broader question about the logic behind identifying key counties, for a race like this, we were interested in a few things. Obviously, we want to make sure that we've got our finger on the pulse of the largest counties, the places where we think most of the votes are going to be coming from. But beyond those kinds of considerations, we're also interested in some geographical things and some demographic considerations. In this race, it was probably leaning much more on the demographic end because we were interested in how Biden's margins would hold up in counties that are majority or at least plurality African American, how Sanders would perform in counties that are younger population, places maybe with a college campus. And we also were interested in counties where there were folks who maybe white voters with higher incomes, white voters with higher levels of education, places where candidates like Buttigieg and Klobuchar had succeeded in earlier states. And so looking at how those kinds of counties tend to perform tonight on more of that demographic lens, just based on the kinds of questions we were interested in and we thought our listeners and viewers would be interested in, has kind of guided our decision-making process on which counties we want to kind of consider the key ones. But certainly we've got an eye on all of the counties, and overall, what we're seeing is in line with what we decided maybe less than a minute into tonight's election night coverage, which is that Joe Biden is the winner and is holding a pretty commanding lead in this race for South Carolina. And it's probably about as good a result as he can get. Podcool, you mentioned earlier about getting that kind of an early call, a decisive win, what that does for Biden from a media and from a narrative standpoint. And I still think that as these results are slowly coming in, it still looks like kind of the perfect storm for Joe Biden. I don't think he could imagine a much better storyline coming out of South Carolina. It was an early win. It was about as quick a call as you can get. He's currently got a lead in every county. He's leading by pretty commanding margins in counties that are majority African American. He's leading by considerable margins in counties that are even counties that are younger, that are whiter, that are higher educated, that are wealthier. So it seems to be a pretty clear and decisive win for Joe Biden, and it seems to hamper the kind of moderate lane candidacies of folks like Buttigieg and Klobuchar. And it also seems to hurt Bernie Sanders' claims to inevitability and maybe even claims to a considerable level of support and in broader kind of coalitions than just his core passionate supporters.
Yeah, that's for sure the case. And I mean, and let's not forget that we're sort of burying the lead here, that Joe Biden started running for president in 1988, and tonight it looks like he's winning his first state. And so it took him a few tries, but let that be a lesson to everybody. You know, try hard. You know, try hard. you too could win a state in the Democratic primary.
Yeah, Drew and I were kicking around a little bit ago whether Biden has the longest gap in American history between initial presidential run and first contest win. Because he initially ran in 1988, and it's taken him till 2020 to win his first contest. I think we kind of kicked around Ron Paul because I know he ran in 1988 for the Libertarians, but he had definitely won the majority of delegates in some states because his supporters had a really strong presence in some county conventions that doled out delegates. But is there anybody else who maybe challenges Biden's record on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. We would need to we got to check our database a little bit to look into that a little bit more closely because I can't think of anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think about the folks who ran in, the 70s and 80s and whether they showed back up and if they were able to win some states. And I mean, I'm thinking of some of them, but they were able, you know what, maybe I think Al Gore, well, it wouldn't have been as long. Biden has about 20 more years on his measure than Gore because Gore ran, I think, for the first time in 1988 and then obviously won the Democratic nomination in 2000. But you tack on an extra 20 years to that, and you have Biden's measure. Um, so yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. And yeah, so just to sort of give a state of the race, we're at 24% precincts reported with 542 of the over 2,000 precincts in the state in, and overwhelmingly looks like we're not looks like we have definitely called it for Joe Biden early, and it looks like sort of as of right now, it is a geographically distributed victory from if we look at say Greenville County where Biden's at 41% of it'll move around a little bit more, less than 10% reporting there, but it's still a sizable victory. And then if we look at other places in the southern part of the state, like in Charleston County, Biden is currently with about a quarter of the precincts reporting Biden at about 47.5% of the vote in. And so some of this is this is a pretty commanding victory so far for Vice President Biden. Again, we are awaiting to see what the delegate count looks like at the end of the night, because we're still going to see where people dance around the threshold a little bit. But it seems to be just a contest between Biden and potentially Bernie walking out with some delegates. It looks pretty unlikely that Tom Steyer or anybody below um, is going to is going to take delegates out of the state. Again, this is a pretty big delegate haul relative to the other early states that we've been seeing. If you go to DecisionDeskHQ.com, we actually have a delegate tracker, our 2020 delegate tracker on the homepage, and this is compiled by the good folks here at Decision Desk HQ, but also the University of Virginia Center for Politics there. And we're going through, we've read the handbooks to see how the delegate allocation works. And these are our best estimates for the delegates. We've already allocated Joe Biden a number of the delegates tonight, and we'll be updating this as the night continues. As it stands, the national delegate race, Bernie is still in the lead right now with 45 delegates, Joe Biden in second with 31, and that's really the big change of tonight, is that Joe Biden just surpassed former Mayor Pete in the delegate count. And it doesn't look like, if things continue to go as they're going, it doesn't look like Mayor Pete's going to leave South Carolina with any delegates. But again, we're going to be tracking that as the evening continues. If I haven't been annoying yet, be sure to like, subscribe, all of those things to Decision Desk HQ on YouTube, Twitch, Twitter, etc., etc. And another story I think that's pretty interesting, looking at where the vote share is right now, is how Biden is doing relative to what the polls were saying in recent days. And so in recent days, we did see that there was a bit of an uptick in Biden's projected vote share. But the Real Clear Politics average going into election day today was Biden at 39.7% of the South Carolina vote. Obviously, there's still a lot of more votes to be counted tonight, but right now we have Biden at just under 49% of the vote share. And so it seems to be that a lot of the public polls that were out there seem to be underestimating Biden's vote share. we were discussing earlier in the night about whether or not how momentum was related to this point, and so it could be. I mean, oftentimes we think about polls as sort of a snapshot of what the electorate um, feels and thinks at a particular moment in time. And so it could be sincere that earlier in the week, the state might not have been convinced on Biden, but after a number of key events, perhaps his finish in Nevada, also some key endorsements in South Carolina, and a relatively strong debate performance, at least I'll say on the Biden scale, a strong debate performance, and so those could have been the pieces that moved people. Alternatively, there could have been some other interesting features, as we've seen in polling more widely, where it could have just been the case that Biden supporters weren't responding to polls at that high of a rate, maybe a little bit embarrassed by how he was doing in some of those early states. But there are some interesting pieces in the polls here that we're going to be tracking. I think, and I had said this on our Around the Desk episode on Friday, I think beating that polling threshold is a pretty big deal for Vice President Biden today. And it's sort of an arbitrary threshold to point to, but it looks like beating it by that much, if the night sort of ends with his vote share at where it's at right now, this is a huge victory for Biden if this holds, not only in the delegate count, not only in the overall vote share in South Carolina, but also what this means in terms of momentum and what the overall media narrative is going to be as we head into the all-important Super Tuesday delegate haul.
Now, here's an interesting thing, Pod Cool, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up, but taking our look at counties that we have some results in already, that we have most of the results in, Darlington County, namesake of a Bruce Springsteen song, they've got 94% of the precincts in. Biden has about 62% in Darlington County, and about 16% rather for Sanders there. So a pretty commanding lead for Biden in Darlington County. And then in Barnwell County, the home birthplace of the hardest working man in show business, James Brown, got about 73% of the precincts reporting there. And similarly, Biden at 62%. But in second place in Barnwell, you've got Steyer at about 17%. Sanders behind him at about 14. So there's our kind of classic music rundown of South Carolina counties and where they stand at the moment.
I gotta say, this isn't the night I think we were necessarily expecting to have. Basically insta calling the race as it became clear over the last couple of days that was where that was going, and then seeing it play out as expected and as internal data was showing that was going to be the case. And now 2 hours into this, I don't think we were expecting to have a call at this point. 2 weeks ago, this race really does move quite a bit, and I think it was something we were talking about earlier. Voters are not hard committed to anybody right now, and maybe we start to see that, or they have their bases obviously, but there's a large pool of voters out there that are waiting to the last minute. We were talking earlier that there's reports that early voting in North Carolina isn't very high, and part of that is because voters don't want to get too far out on the limb because it could change so fast, as it has changed so fast in this race. So again, this is obviously the kind of night the Biden campaign probably was dreaming of, and then to see it come through, there's no way to spin this as anything other than a very good, very big night for Joe Biden. Anything else is just sort of not based in reality. But that doesn't mean there aren't 7 or 8 more twists in this. What do you guys think in terms of the momentum and how this is happening? I think this is going to have to happen in stages. You're probably going to see a little more winnowing of the field. The next debate, I believe, is the week after Super Tuesday. I don't think we're going to see the same people on that stage that we saw on the last stage. There'll be some attrition by then, and then we'll start to see this happening. But I just wonder. I know we keep saying it's early, but there are big states coming up in on Super Tuesday. A large percentage of the vote of the delegates will be apportioned by then. Bernie Sanders is not going to have a night like this in every state, far from it. He's going to have nights like Biden's having tonight in some of these states. And so I think looking at it overall, we may just sort of be seeing some attrition, but it's not going to coalesce into a two-person race early enough that you could see what happened in 2016, where Hillary Clinton went out to a lead and never gave it back. She wasn't able to put Bernie Sanders out of the race or mathematically clinch it towards the end. But I don't think we're going to see that. I think we're going to see a lot of back and forth. I think it's going to be Bernie Sanders and Joe Biden trading punches all the way to Milwaukee.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm looking for at the moment is where, if you're Sanders' campaign and you know, you're looking for some positives to find even in a night like this. You look at Pickens County, which is it was Sanders' best county in South Carolina in 2016. He won about 44% there then. It's on the younger side. It's the home of Clemson University. It's also over 90% white. So it seems to have all of the makings of a pretty solidly Sanders County. But with about 36% of the precincts in Pickens County, Biden's leading there with about 35%, Sanders behind him at about 27. And so, certainly there's still about 2/3 of the votes to come in from Pickens, but that seems to be the kind of county where you would expect Sanders to be leading. It was his best county in 2016, and it appears to, at the moment, be among his better counties this time, but he's still pretty clearly behind Biden there. So, a lot of the things that you might be able to lean on as explaining away this loss, if you're Sanders' campaign, of saying, well, African American voters were overwhelmingly supportive of Biden. Well, older voters, overwhelmingly support Biden, those kinds of things. You look at a county like Pickens, and you would expect that has the kind of things that would lean more in Sanders' direction, and to still be pretty clearly behind there I'm just struggling to find a lot here for Sanders' campaign to point to and find positives in.
Yeah, I don't think there is much. I think they're going to say, well, it's been nice visiting South Carolina so long. It's just not his state. There's nothing to spin here. One person who I think has sort of really been hurt by this Biden night was Tom Steyer. He spent a lot of money. He spent a lot of time. He's getting me in third. If you had talked at the beginning of the year, did you, at the beginning of this campaign year, did you think Tom Steyer would come in third someplace? I don't think a lot of people would have taken that. Right now, he's in third place in South Carolina. You have to look at it as it probably hurt Joe Biden a little bit. He could have maybe had even a bigger night. But, Steyer was banking on having a third place night, and it's going to get no play because, this is just Joe Biden's night. So even if you do beat expectations and you have this sort of surprise finish, it's not going to pay off, at least in the case of Tom Steyer, I'd imagine. I can't see this sort of launching him into something else. Can you?
Not likely. I think that there are a handful of counties where he is in a pretty clear second place to Biden, where he edges out Sanders. But I think you're absolutely right that it's a difficult sell for him. I think he needed to make more inroads against Biden than he appears to have in order to really make a splash.
Like if Sanders had won and it was a tight couple of points, Biden second, Steyer in third, maybe he says, hey, look what I did against this guy with this huge history and this huge name. He's on the decline, I'm on the upswing. But now there's just no story for anybody coming out of South Carolina other than Joe Biden. It's not just Bernie Sanders that doesn't have a story or a spin on this. They just got beat. I mean, the only thing for Steyer that might happen is he might get a couple of delegates at the congressional district level.
Right.
We don't have it statewide at that, but maybe in some of the congressional districts he'll get a delegate or three.
Right. I mean, you look at a county like Fairfield where we've got 100% of the vote in. It's a majority African American county, and right now, I mean, Biden is at 61% in that county, and Steyer is in second at 20. Sanders is down at 11%. And so it's, I think for Steyer, he maybe did more to maybe hurt Sanders' narrative coming out of tonight than he did to really make any inroads against Biden in the lane that he's competing for. But that seems to be the effect that the money he spent has had.
Yeah, I think the one piece, and we had a sort of a longer conversation about it earlier in the night, is where does Bloomberg fit into this mess? I mean, we sort of see we have a good track record on how everybody else is doing at the polls, and maybe a good expectation of what to expect based on maybe the demographic composition of the states that have gone so far. But we still haven't seen, apart from Dixville Notch, anything about the Bloomberg voters and sort of what they might look like. And it could hurt Joe Biden. It could hurt Joe Biden pretty severely. Maybe, I mean, especially after Bloomberg addresses the nation tomorrow night to tell us about how he would take on a coronavirus. I don't know if either of you had seen that, but he's going to be addressing. He bought 3 minutes of broadcast time on 2 of the networks that he's going to be talking tomorrow night about coronavirus. Sort of an interesting move to pivot away from South Carolina as quickly as possible, to maybe deflect what he saw as some of the positives for the Biden campaign coming out of today. But I think that's sort of a looming question mark, especially because of the early vote in some of these places with big delegate halls. What's the gut reaction for both of you about Bloomberg in this race and going forward?
Well, I think that one of the things that has me kind of, has kind of piqued my interest tonight is I think that in a lot of ways we've been thinking about, well, if Biden stumbles, does that open the door for Bloomberg? But I also wonder about whether Sanders underperforming tonight opens a door for Bloomberg, not in the sense that, hardcore Sanders supporters will jump ship, but in the sense that maybe some of the folks that the Sanders campaign was hoping would kind of reluctantly jump on board with, a sense of inevitability. Maybe those are the kind of folks who go to Bloomberg. I mean, if you look at some of the counties where we've got a lot of result, Hampton County is a majority African-American county. We've got 94% of the vote in. Biden's up with 53% of the vote there. Steyer in second at 26%. Sanders is at 15. You look at even a county on the opposite end of the spectrum. You look at, I'm definitely going to mispronounce this, but Oconee County. It's 88% white, and it was Sanders' second best county in 2016. He got 40% of the vote there. We've got 100% of the precincts in, and Biden won there about 38% to Sanders 24, with Steyer pulling about 13% there. So, I mean, I'm just looking at, the counties where we've got some significant results, and I'm just struggling to find where Sanders, really asserted himself with any sense of making inroads in different communities, making any kind of show of inevitability. And I think that maybe that opens the door for a Bloomberg, because now there is an appetite for some non-Sanders flavors. And I think that maybe a stronger showing from Sanders tonight would have helped close that gap a little bit and show that, he's here. He's not just here for the long haul with his core supporters, but that he can maybe expand his appeal beyond that. And I think that becomes a more difficult argument to make.
Yeah, I think what we've seen tonight is the reset of the race. We've answered some questions, but I think some new ones have been posed going forward. And I think we're gonna wrap it up now. It's a much earlier night than we expected, at least during the course of the last week or two. But in the last few days, it really did become clear that this was going to be Joe Biden's night. It definitely has been. We're going to keep collecting the votes, keep reporting them out. We're also going to be tracking the delegates. So we appreciate you listening to this, and we appreciate Matt Shore's time. Get that right this time, sorry. Dr. Alexander Podcool. And we appreciate you spending your election night with us. If you could give us a like, a favorite, a whatever is the appropriate thing to do on your favorite streaming site, we would appreciate that. And we'll, like I said, we'll be updating the vote totals and the all-important delegate counts throughout the evening. So follow us on Twitter at Decision Desk HQ, where we'll be updating all of that. We will be back on Monday with a wrap-up and a preview of Super Tuesday, noon. So we hope you'll join us for that on these very same streaming services. Until then, I'm Drew McCoy. Thanks very much for joining
Drew,
us.
I just want to say, Drew, before we sign off,
But
we
wait,
got a nice
there's more.
big dump of. But wait, there's more. Call now, and no, there is another nice big drop of votes, and we're up to about 47% of the precincts in statewide. And so we've gotten a nice big chunk of votes, and overall, we've still got Biden at about 50% of the vote. Sanders in second at about 19, Steyer in third at about 11. And again, the story overall is just Biden dominance. He's leading in every county at the moment. Steyer is pulling a second place in some key counties. It's a difficult night for Sanders to make any claim of broadening his appeal or of inevitability. So interesting results at that level of things. We were talking about a few counties where we just got full results. Williamsburg County is a majority African American county. We've got all the votes in there, and we've got Biden at 70% of the vote. I mean, in a race with a field this large, that's an absolutely commanding lead. Sanders is in second place with about 14%. So we're talking a nearly 60% margin of victory for Biden in Williamsburg County. So, these are the narrative difficulties if you're Sanders, and some of the narrative boons if you're Biden. Winning decisively and being able to kind of stop any progress from your main rival in communities where he needed to make some inroads.
Yeah, this has actually turned out to be an almost Hillary Clinton-esque type victory, which you didn't think would happen given the size of the field. But Biden is definitely lapping the field tonight, and there's just no story other than that. Yeah, Joe Biden is very popular in South Carolina. I think we can safely say that among Democrats, at least, that this has been a place he pinned his hopes on. He told us he was going to win. He called his shot and he delivered it. And he's obviously going to reap the rewards of it. He's going to reap delegates. He's going to reap momentum, a lot of good publicity going into Super Tuesday. And the question will be, can he translate that into Super Tuesday votes? And where does Bernie Sanders make his comeback? That's obviously the storyline for the next 2.5 days. And we will be here talking about that again on Monday, noon. We'll do another Around the Desk, and then we'll be back with election results and delegate counts on Super Tuesday, the all-important Super Tuesday that will really help to define, I think, the shape of this race. So until then, I'm Drew McCoy.
Drew, I'm going to comment on
Oh, come on.
one more time. I'm telling you, we're turning into
keep happening. We got to stop.
But call now. And no, we've got our good friend Alex Aldunson here to tell us a little bit about some delegate math before we let everybody go. So, Alex, if you want to update us on that, you have the floor.
Yeah, so delegates haven't been as big of a story up to this point. Super Tuesday, they will be massively important because it doesn't really matter whether Bernie wins 7 states or Biden wins 7 states. It's about, do they have an insurmountable delegate lead? So we're tracking it in South Carolina here, and essentially what we're seeing is that Biden is poised to win a grand majority of the delegates tonight. Bernie looks like he's going to pick up some. Looks like he's going to be above the 15% threshold statewide. and in some or most of the congressional districts. And then the interesting thing that we're also tracking is whether Steyer is going to be able to pick up any delegates. He is at 11% right now, well short of the 15% threshold. He's a little close in a couple of the congressional districts, so it's possible that he will eke out one delegate or maybe a couple. But right now, that's kind of the lay of the land. I'm preparing a new update for DDHQ for these delegates that will be out in the next 10 minutes. So watch out for that.
Now, Alex, there was some talk coming in that in congressional district 1 that Buttigieg might be able to snag a delegate. Do we think that that's likely, unlikely at this point? What do we think?
So right now he is, let me take a look at congressional district 1. He is not looking great for that. No. He is currently trailing Sanders by quite a bit. He is outperforming Warren and Steyer in CD1, but he is still below the threshold there. Specifically, he is at 11%. So it's looking unlikely.
All right. Well, thank you for the update, Alex. Putting in the hard work, helping us come up with our delegate numbers for our 2020 delegate tracker.
Yeah, absolutely. I will now go back to typing
Right.
furiously on my keyboard.
Back to your calculator.
Oh no, I'm not saying anything at this point.
Drew, if you would like to do the honors, I promise I won't interrupt you this time.
Nope. You
Here.
play us out.
Here, I'll
Your
I'll
show.
skip to the important part. If you've enjoyed our stream, like and subscribe if you're on YouTube. Follow us on Twitch. As Drew has said, I believe a couple times now, we will be doing. Ooh. I heard that Steyer is making an announcement shortly, so we'll see what happens there. Anyway, we will see you Super Tuesday. We will see you on the weekly shows that we have. Thanks for tuning in. It's been an eventful night, and we'll do it all again 3 days from now.